Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C., as well as editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. And today I have the pleasure of conversing with Jarrett Stepman, who is a columnist with the Daily Signal at the Heritage Foundation. And mostly we're going to discuss his brand new book, which neither one of us has within arm's reach, so we can't hold it up for you. But Jarrett, great to have you with us, and tell us the title of your book and what it's about.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. The title of my book is The War on History, The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past. And it's about the general attacks on American history that, of course, have very much ramped up in recent days, even since the point when I wrote this book. I went through American history and discussed a lot of the figures that at that time were coming under attack, either from intellectuals, from general American society, and I would say now, even mobs who have now descended upon statues of their likeness around the country. And I did a tour of American history and explained not only why those individuals and figures were under attack, but why they're still worth defending, why Americans should still stand for these individuals and discuss their legacy even in modern times.
Well, as you know, the latest attack, especially pertinent to those of us who live in the D.C. area, was on the statue of Andrew Jackson in Lafayette Park across from the White House, which I believe may be the oldest standing outdoor statue in Washington, D.C. It dates before the Civil War, 1840s or 1850s.
It's actually originally was constructed in 1852. I believe it was the first large equestrian statue in the country. Certainly, if you visit Washington, D.C., it's an impressive statue that stands in front of the White House. Of course, there are many now, mostly of a lot of Civil War generals. But Jackson was one of the earliest ones that stood in front of the White House that was commemorated just before the Civil War, which I think is very interesting, especially because right at the base it has the quote, "Our federal union, it must be preserved," which was Jackson's very famous line that he said during a tribute during the nullification crisis, which was kind of a preview of the Civil War that occurred in the 1830s. And Jackson was known as a notable unionist, and to a certain extent, Abraham Lincoln, his own policies to restore the Union, relied on some of the arguments that Jackson, his administration made back in the 1830s. So there was a very notable connection between Jackson and unionist ideas that prevailed in large parts of the country in 1860.
Now, the increasingly popular movement to remove someone like Andrew Jackson would, whether by mob action or by more legitimate legal means, would simply dismiss him as a racist. He relocated the Cherokees, most infamously, and he owned slaves himself. But as you say, he had a very long and complicated life, full of accomplishments, negative and positive. So to respond to those who aren't even necessarily on the left, but who have a very negative view of Andrew Jackson, why should his statue remain in so prominent a place in the nation's capital?
Yeah, well, first of all, he was very emblematic of his generation of Americans, those who were very young or just being born at the time of the American Revolution. I mean, this was the first American generation that was born as Americans, essentially, and they were the ones who inherited the Republic from the founders. Jackson was very much emblematic of many Americans who witnessed the Revolutionary War, became fiercely patriotic, fiercely attached to this new country that at the time, many Americans, our perspective in the 21st century as America kind of always was, but to a certain extent for many, America was an experiment. It was an experiment in self-government. And Jackson believed in that government so wholeheartedly. He was really a ferocious patriot who was totally willing to put his life on the line anytime that country was challenged, and of course became most famous and the thing that launched him to the presidency for his role in the War of 1812, and specifically the Battle of New Orleans, which was a pivotal moment in American history. You could say maybe the biggest battle since the victory at Yorktown that occurred during the American Revolution. It was something that was widely celebrated in this country. In fact, there was even really a holiday January 8th was celebrated as Andrew Jackson Day for a long time in this country because of his victory at New Orleans at a time where the country was really feeling defeated by the War of 1812, which had many setbacks, but ended on the highest note possible, where there's this rough-hewn man with no military training who beats many of the British soldiers who had fought alongside Wellington, who had beaten Napoleon. It was a phenomenal victory. I mean, some newspapers called it nearly a miracle. Jackson became the figurehead of that as the man who would do anything to save his country. And it launched him to the presidency. And this is a man who really had no connection to the founding generation. He was born to Irish immigrants, Scotch-Irish immigrants. He didn't have a notable name. He was in many ways a self-made man. Americans came to respect and admire this person as somebody what we would all hope that if there is trouble in the United States, if there's an invasion, if we're threatened, that we'd have people like Andrew Jackson to defend us. And that is ultimately what his victory symbolized, and certainly his presidency was wrapped around that idea. And again, going back to our federal union, it must be preserved. I think his legacy and standing for the union during the nullification crisis showed strength and leadership at a time when the country appeared to be maybe coming apart. Jackson stood for the union. He believed in the experiment that was America, and he would stand by it with force if necessary. And I think that's something that's notable, especially as today, as we're dealing with a lot of civil unrest. We're dealing with a lot of cities that do seem to be in anarchy. To think about Andrew Jackson and the leadership he took at that time, when he may have seen something, in some ways very similar, where you had whole regions willing to break off from the union, Jackson standing by that union wholeheartedly and not backing down.
Of course, the war against statues initially focused just on Confederate figures. It has expanded way beyond that to target founding fathers, Andrew Jackson, even Union generals, General Grant himself. The Lincoln statue in London seemed to be defaced. The Teddy Roosevelt statue in New York now coming down, although for somewhat complicated reasons. The Churchill statue defaced in London, controversy about the Gandhi statue. So this whole movement seems to be hostile not just to United States history, but to Western civilization, if you include Gandhi in Western civilization, which I think you arguably can. So how do you explain this emergent perspective that the West is simply a catalog of evils that must be overturned?
Well, that's exactly what this is. I think that's really at the heart of the riots and now the protests that we're seeing. I mean, it really is an attack on Western civilization. There's no common thread between a Confederate statue of Winston Churchill. I think that the overall message, and look, I mean, we had the New York Times that went ahead with this Pulitzer Prize winning essay, the 1619 Project, that reframed America's past on the idea that it's based around slavery and racism. But these ideas aren't really new. I think they've been really stewing, and especially a lot of our schools, and I think especially academia and the media throughout the West, not just in the United States, that somehow that our sins as a civilization are not just bad, they're uniquely evil, that the West is uniquely bad. And I think that's the message that we're getting. Look, I think we're getting it from academia. And I think to a certain extent, that's in large part an ignorance about larger history, both American history, both Western history, and also world history, which frankly, anybody who's studied the longer scope of human history notices quite a bit of tyranny, violence, bigotry. There's a whole lot of evil there. And frankly, no civilization, no people is free of sin and blame and all that, because I think human beings, by their very nature, are fallen and will be errant. I mean, they will be, and they will fail. And I think that's part of the problem with this entire movement, is it's become really a kind of purity movement. We're trying to purify all the so-called sins of the past. We're purifying, all these people who were human beings who lived in times that there were many challenges that we today don't face at all. And I do wonder, in this kind of movement for purity and going through the past and making sure that they're politically correct, that we'll miss even the sins of our own time, because we think of ourselves is so far above it. I would wonder, really, I would say that, what would people 100 years in our past say about our attitudes toward the issue of abortion, and how many people throughout the West view this today? Is this something that we're going to be judged for 100 years from now? And I do wish that people would look at, this, maybe even the sins of our own time, instead of this idea that we're going to comb through the past and see all these flaws and failings and remove them and somehow perfect society. I think that's based on a mistaken notion of what humanity really is. And I think that doesn't serve us today to how we understand our own world and what's around us. I think it gives us a one-dimensional view of the world. It makes us more destructive, more hateful, and more incapable of actually tackling real evils in this world that are undoubtedly to come.
So as you say, it really is a theological perspective that's being advocated that assumes humanity, at least if you're part of a specified identity group, is basically good and not fallen, but humanity is stained by Western civilization from which it must purge itself, after which there will ostensibly be some form of undefined liberation.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the really, I think, truly terrible parts of this kind of purity iconoclast movement is that, there really is no redemption in this movement. Unlike Christianity, where there is redemption, we understand that, all human beings we're fallen. We're somewhere between the beasts and the angels, but we are fallen. This movement seeks some kind of purity, some kind of utopia, but there is no redemption. For those who have strayed from the line, they become canceled. They become unpersoned. It's a ruthless movement ultimately, and I think that's one of the real dangers of this. And I think that's why you see all these mobs that are now gathered around American cities and cities throughout the West. I don't think there's a whole lot of forgiveness there. I don't think there's a whole lot of understanding of other people, and I worry, especially as we are seeing an outbreak of violence against statues. How long until this turns to violence against their fellow citizens who think differently from them? And that's very much my worry here, is that not only are we going to purge our own history, but we're going to turn that anger and that hate toward other people, to fellow citizens. And I think that's a very worrying thing for our time, and that is the challenge of this time. I mean, that's, I think, why this whole movement is ultimately so malignant.
When we examine people from the past, of course, this current moment is determined to judge people in history completely by contemporary standards, which are themselves in constant evolution. It's very difficult to keep up with contemporary standards of judgment. But how should we more correctly judge people from the past? Strictly by the standards of their own time? Or do we attempt to sit on the throne with God and judge them by some kind of eternal standard? Or is it a combination of all of the above?
I think it really is a combination of all of the above. I think if we do want to put up tributes to people, we should pick them mainly for their primary accomplishments. But I think there's this mistake too when we look at statues. They aren't just statues to the men or the individuals they put up. They do reflect the kind of what the society valued at the time. They kind of, some of these statues are put up because people were trying to give tributes to things like heroism and courage, and these are universal values. I think that do stand up the test of time. I think those are very universal things. This idea that we can comb through history, like, for instance, with Thomas Jefferson, who has become one of those individuals who's come under attack. This is a man who, by the standards of the cancelers, he was a man who owned slaves, and therefore he's been canceled, despite the fact that it's his very words, his very ideas, and even many of his actions that led to the utter eradication of slavery, not just in this country, but throughout the Western world. Is that a monumental accomplishment? Is that overcome by the fact that he had personal failings, was incapable of getting rid of a system that existed throughout human history, and certainly persisted from America's birth? Does that mean that he's no longer somebody we can celebrate or praise? I don't think so at all. And to say also, I think there's another countenance of, well, we can celebrate the ideas, but we can't celebrate the man. I think that's also a mistake. I think it's a mistake because, again, it gives us a stultified view of human nature and humanity. Flawed human beings have created some of the greatest things that we enjoy on this earth. people who have had ideas that are very much wrong. They have done things that we would see as very much wrong, but they've created a lot of the good things that we enjoy. Instead of trying to get rid of them or bury them or tear down their statues, it's better for us, especially for those, look, we enjoy many fruits of American civilization, of what's been built before. I think there's no doubt that America has created an enormous amount of prosperity for the widest number of people of any country in human history. It's upon us to understand how that was created. It wasn't created by angels. It was created by human beings, many of whom tried to do their best and believed that they were creating a better country, not just for themselves, but the millions who were unborn. And I think, especially when we look at those who we do pay tribute to, it's important to keep those things in mind. And certainly as we go through history and look for individuals, we are going to find faults in every single one. There's nobody who is going to escape this perch, not a single one. What does that leave us with? Does that leave us with a better civilization, one that has less hate, less bigotry, less of all these things that some of these statue topplers say? I don't think so. I think it's actually going to make us, in some ways, more hateful, more contemptuous of our neighbors and fellow human beings than otherwise. And certainly is going to get rid of, I think, that critical element of mercy and forgiveness as well for those who have done us wrong.
So we're going through this moment of iconoclasm, which others would point out is itself a part of Western civilization and specifically of Christianity. So this moment will pass at some point. But do you find any cause for hope at this point? Beyond the publication of your book, are there other positive trends to examine? It seems like good biographies of founding fathers, for example, tend to sell very well. There's still a tremendous amount of interest in them and even veneration for them, despite academic and social trends against them. So what words of hope do you have for us?
I really believe this moment requires leadership from people who still say they believe in what this country and what the West was built on, to go out there and be unafraid to say that. I think there are a lot of people right now, they're sitting inside, they're watching on TV, they're seeing mobs and vandals really destroy every symbol of the civilization completely lawlessly, completely against the law. And I think that unfortunately, there are a lot of elected officials and unelected officials who want to placate that mob. And I think Americans they want to see somebody stand up. They want to see multiple leaders stand up right now and be unafraid to defend that civilization. The United States, the West, is not inherently systematically racist. They want to hear that. They want to hear, well, what was this country built on? I think people do want education about our past. I think Americans have been very good about looking at their own history and addressing the failings that we have. We've had many failings. We still have many failings. I don't think that's our problem. I think right now we need people to defend the good things that this country and the West was built on. We need leaders who can articulate that, why these things were good. And I think that'll ultimately, look, I do have faith that will ultimately stem the tide, especially as we bring education to people. I think there's a huge battle that's going on in our schools around the country. The 1619 Project, the Pulitzer Prize winning 1619 Project, which was, I think, very much based on a lot of dishonest history. It's going to be pushed in K-12 schools around the country. American parents need to wake up to that fact, and they need to push back, either push back on their local public schools or take their children out of those schools and give them an education elsewhere. So I think it's a combination of leadership at this moment when Western civilization is under attack from within and from without. And also a moment to reflect and say, we need to go back and be better at educating Americans, at looking at the institutions that have peddled, I think, a lot of falsehoods about our history and what this country is about, and retake those institutions and go back and re-argue to the American people why we should be informed patriots. And I think there's a lot of information out there. There are a lot of biographies and I think more of that work needs to be done from people who do have the intention of creating, again, another generation of informed patriots, because far too many, especially in my generation of millennials, were educated with something very different.
Jarrett Stepman, author of The War on History, The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past. Thank you very much for an informative conversation.
Thank you very much.